Hi, I am Tina Mazalewski, and I am a lead scientist at Conservation Science Partners. And I have maybe been working in the biome a little bit less than some of the folks in this room. I started working in the sagebrush biome about a year and a half ago, and I started working for Conservation Science Partners. And as I started learning about the biome and hearing about sagebrush biome decline and causes of loss, I really started thinking about conservation implementation. How much conservation are we doing? Are we doing conservation at scale to mitigate those losses? Are we doing enough to defend the core? And if not, how much more do we need to do? So that was kind of the primer, I guess, for the work I'm going to present today. So to talk about whether a conservation gap exists and what we would need to do to close it, we're going to focus on three themes. First, core sagebrush area loss. Second, what is the state of current conservation? And then finally, what do we need to do to close the gap? So starting with core sagebrush area loss, in order to understand how much conservation we need to be doing to mitigate the loss, we need to understand how much loss is happening in the first place. What is the deficit that we need to make up if we want to actually defend the core and stop biome loss? And then what does that trajectory look like in the future? And then finally, Kevin alluded to this, but what are the causes of biome decline? And so to ask these questions, we used the sagebrush conservation design, or the data underpinning it, basically to look at core sagebrush area over time and how that's changed over the past 20 or so years. The data in the SCD occurs or is mapped at 5-year time steps, but a recent data release just hot off the presses, enabled us to look at changes in core sagebrush area at an annual time step, which was really exciting. And so the green line on the left-hand side of the screen right there, that is your change in core sagebrush area over time from 2000 to 2021 at an annual time step. And basically, we're losing about 760,000 acres a year on average. You'll see that there are absolutely years of core sagebrush area gain, but there's a predominant loss trend over time. We also wanted to look at what the trajectory might look like going forward over the next 20 years to kind of give us a picture of what's ahead. And so to do that, we looked at proportional rates of change over the past 20 years. And then we basically fit those proportional rates of change to a normal distribution and ran 1,000 simulations. So starting at your core sagebrush area available at 2021, picking a random rate of change, applying it to that 2021 acreage to get a 2022 acreage, pulling another random rate of change to get a 2023 acreage out to 2040. And so we did that for 1,000 iterations, and that included both loss rates and gain rates to basically get this future trajectory. And what we're seeing in that trajectory is basically an additional 25% loss in core sagebrush area by the time 2040 hits, which is about another 9 million acres. There's obviously a ton of variability in that number, but that is the average from those 1,000 replicates. And then this is what Kevin hit on earlier, but we also wanted to look at causes of core sagebrush decline. Which of those 5 components of sagebrush ecological integrity, which are, just as a refresher, invasive annual grass, conifer encroachment, human modification, loss of, well, just perennial grass and sagebrush cover. And how were those contributing to changes in SEI and loss of core sagebrush areas? And my favorite way to frame this that I've heard from Kevin and from Dave, and I think Alex has started picking up, is that invasive annual grass is eating our lunch, basically. So invasive annual grass is the main contributor to core sagebrush area loss at 69%. Conifer encroachment is another 18%, and then to a lesser extent, loss of those key habitat components. Okay, so core sagebrush area is declining by an average of 760,000 acres a year. It's largely driven by invasive annual grass. How are we doing in terms of our conservation? For this, we wanted to look at both conservation volume in the biome, but also the proportion of conservation treatments that are targeting those specific causes of decline, and then where that conservation is happening across the biome. So to do this, we looked at both data from the Land Treatment Digital Library, which is a USGS database that catalogs Bureau of Land Management treatments in the Western US. And then we also looked at treatments on private lands from NRCS Sage Grouse Conservation Initiative. Going forward, I'm just going to abbreviate it. So the BLM data, I'm going to call LTDL, Land Treatment Digital Library, and then the Sage Grouse Initiative private land data is going to be SGI. And so I want to note here that, especially for the Land Treatment Digital Library, there are a ton of different treatment types that are recorded in that. We are only focusing on treatments that were not in response to wildfire, first of all, different programmatic initiatives and focus, but treatments that are focusing on those causes of decline. So herbicide application for invasive annual grass, conifer removal, and then native seeding for those key habitat components. So for the LTDL and SGI data combined over the past 20 years, here is what conservation implementation has looked like. And then I've got the averages, annual averages up here. And so at first glance, this might seem a little alarming. We're talking about, 760,000 acres of loss on average a year, relative to 275,000 acres of conservation. This isn't the whole picture. This is just a really fine scale look at conservation from two major conservation players in the biome. We know that in addition to the treatment data that are captured by the LTDL and SGI, that other state and federal agencies, NGOs, private landowners are all doing meaningful conservation in the biome. And for a more inclusive representation of biome-wide conservation efforts, we used the Conservation Efforts Database. And we used the CED to kind of scale up our estimates of annual conservation that are taking place. So the CED contains a sagebrush module where federal and state government resource agencies, and again, those NGOs and private landowners, as well as tribal partners and industry, can report voluntarily the conservation that they're doing in the sagebrush biome. And so the CED data, Conservation Efforts Database, those data are spatially obscured to protect private landowner information. And so we didn't have a spatial component to those data, but we did use them just to scale up our estimates of average annual conservation and to say, we're getting 159,000 acres reported by SGI and LTDL, but really the bigger picture is there's like 330,000 acres of herbicide application that are happening in the biome at least. And so these numbers reflect that CED scaling, but they show where that conservation is taking place in the biome from data from the LTDL and SGI, where we actually had those spatial data available. And basically this just shows, how much of each of these treatment types are happening in core versus growth versus other. So for invasive annual grass, it's a little over 10% that's happening for herbicide application in core sagebrush areas. For conifer encroachment, it's almost 23%. And then for native seeding, we're looking at about 11%. For invasive annual grass, the majority of those treatment acres are happening in other rangeland areas. And then for conifer encroachment and native seeding, the majority are happening in growth opportunity areas. But when you kind of combine all of this, at least in terms of the volume of conservation, the picture maybe starts to look a little more hopeful. We're doing like 575,000 acres on average of conservation relative to 760,000 acres of core sagebrush area loss. So numbers-wise, maybe the picture doesn't seem quite as grim. But I'm maybe about to change that and remove the rose-colored glasses a little bit. So through this whole project, one of the things we discovered is looking at treatments that occurred predominantly in either growth opportunity areas or other rangeland areas pre-treatment. what proportion of those treatments actually converted to mostly core sagebrush area post-treatment? Like after one treatment, did you actually grow the core? And we found that for treatments occurring in growth opportunity areas, less than 10% of them actually were able to turn that treatment landscape to a majority percent core. And in fact, for herbicide application, it was like 1.5%, conifer removal just over 2%, and native seeding was about 9%. And then for treatments that happened in other rangeland areas, none of those treatments were actually able to restore all the way back to core. And so when we start thinking about conservation acres that are being implemented that are actually going towards defending the core and growing the core, it's really the acres that are happening already in core sagebrush areas to stop that decline really before it starts. Those are the acres that actually are counting to defend the core and stop biome loss. When you start painting that picture, the amount of conservation that we're doing relative to the loss is about 10% in total. One thing I want to point out before we move on here is when we talk about conservation acres needed, we're talking both about the loss of core sagebrush area that's attributed to each threat, in addition to the conservation that's already happening in core sagebrush areas. And that's because without that conservation that was taking place right now, the loss of core sagebrush areas would likely be higher. So when we talk about conservation need, right, we're talking about what we're doing now plus the rest of what we need to do to meet that conservation deficit. So how do we do that? How do we close the conservation gap and remove that conservation deficit? To do this, we kind of took a scenarios approach. We wanted to evaluate how much more conservation we would need to do under business as usual conservation, where we're managing in the same proportions in core and growth and other, right? So less than 20% of most of your conservation treated acres are happening in core. How much more do we need to do? Then we looked at core targeting, where you basically flip the proportion of treatment acres that are happening today in growth opportunity areas and other rangeland areas, flip that to all of that happening in core sagebrush areas. So instead of 80% outside of core, you're treating 80% in core. The bonus acres scenario includes that 80% treatment in core, but also reflects the fact that treating in core is cheaper than treating other places in the biome. And so you're able to leverage additional conservation acres from the money that you saved. We simulated programmatic alignment. So Kevin talked about overlap between fire programs and potentially, overlapping priorities, especially considering climate change. So we simulated a 25% overlap in data from the LTDL that weren't shown in previous slides, but were herbicide application and conifer encroachment or conifer removal specifically in response to wildfire. And then we also simulated a resource influx, which is basically through bipartisan infrastructure law or Inflation Reduction Act or other policy mechanisms, an additional, basically being able to double the amount of conservation that we're doing in the biome as we're seeing this influx of resources. All scenarios other than the business as usual scenario were additive. So your bonus acres also includes core targeting. Your programmatic alignment assumes that you're treating 80% in core and getting the bonus acres, et cetera. And then we wanted to evaluate these scenarios under a range of treatment responses because we know that how treatment response is highly variable on the landscape. And so we wanted to basically get a sense of how much more across a range of potential treatment responses. So we looked at perfect treatment response, where you do an acre of conservation in core sagebrush areas and it is core forever. It stays, that's great. Conservative retreatment estimates, so maybe over the span of 20 years, you would need to go back a second time to maintain core, and more aggressive retreatment, where it's going to take more than 1 or 2 treatments over a 20-year period to maintain core. And so here is where the rubber meets the road and where Kevin mentioned that scary 60 times more number. So the darker colors for each of these kind of plots represents perfect response, and then the middle is conservative retreatment, and then the last one is aggressive retreatment. Under business as usual conservation, for perfect treatment response, to get at all of the acres of core sagebrush area loss from invasive annual grass, you're going to need to do 14 times the amount of conservation that you're doing. If you start talking about the need for aggressive retreatment, you're up to 60 times more conservation. But there's a significant drop once you start implementing core targeting and these other practices. So as soon as you switch to targeting 80% in core, for perfect treatment response, then you have to do twice as much conservation. You're down from 14 times as much to twice as much. And then even under, aggressive retreatment, you're sitting at 9 times more instead of 60 times more. By the time you get down to resource influx, with perfect retreatment, you have surpassed being able to defend the core. You are doing more conservation than you actually need to do to defend the core, and you are sitting at actually being able to grow the core. We see maybe a less scary and dramatic picture for conifer encroachment, but still the same trends. Business as usual conservation is not sustainable. Anywhere from 5 to 12 times more conservation is going to be required to address the threat of conifer encroachment to core sagebrush area loss. When you get down to that resource influx scenario, almost across the board, you are at least able to defend the core, and under perfect treatment response and conservative retreatment, you are well into being able to grow the core. And again, we see the same thing for native seeding, and perhaps even more dramatically. Right now, under business as usual conservation, I'm smiling because it's bad, 23 times more conservation under perfect treatment response, 81 times more conservation under aggressive retreatment. By the time you get down to that resource influx, you're again sitting at least being able to defend the core with conservative retreatment, if not being able to grow the core. So here's the last really major slide. And this just shows in total for all of the treatment types combined. This does show perfect treatment response, but what does it look like for each of these kind of additive scenarios to get us to defending the core, or maybe even beyond that and being able to grow the core? And basically this shows that even with perfect treatment response, we're going to have to do 10 times more conservation in the biome under business as usual conservation targeting to actually be able to defend the core. When you start switching to core targeting, all of a sudden you're down to twice as much. And then by the time you get to that resource influx, you are well over being able to defend the core, and you are sitting at actually being able to grow the core. A couple caveats really quickly. Obviously, we're missing any unreported conservation treatment acres. And for the CED, that includes estimates of retreatment, not just first-time treatment. So that just reflects kind of conservation capacity in the biome at large. These are coarse estimates of where conservation is happening in the biome, and we have an incomplete understanding of treatment success and failure. We've tried to provide a range of, possible retreatment requirements, but there's a lot of uncertainty there. These estimates don't include climate change, so we might actually need more conservation than this is showing. And obviously, this is meant to serve as a simple spatial thought exercise and not to be prescriptive.